April 8, 1945. The world was collapsing by the hour, and in a Berlin that no longer resembled a city but a vast graveyard of ideals, one solitary figure sat in a dim, dust-filled office that had grown far too quiet. The walls trembled faintly from distant artillery fire, an unbroken drumbeat of approaching defeat. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the once unassailable chief of German military intelligence, sat motionless at his desk, his hands resting upon a stack of worn folders whose contents he no longer needed to read. He had memorized every line, every figure, every bitter implication years ago. Those pages had arrived exactly 2 years before, classified intelligence reports stamped Geheime Reichssache. The numbers within them had not changed. The ink on those pages was as dark and permanent as the truth they carried. But everything surrounding that truth, the empire, the ideology, the illusion of invincibility, had disintegrated. The Reich that once stretched across Europe now shrank by the day, devoured from every direction. Canaris, who had built his career upon precision, secrecy, and quiet judgment, found himself confronting the one decision he had avoided for too long. It was no longer about belief versus disbelief, optimism versus pessimism. The war had stripped those words of meaning. What remained was something far simpler and infinitely more terrifying. Did he possess the courage to speak aloud what he knew, knowing that truth itself had become treason? This is the story of a man standing at the thin intersection between knowledge and survival, between truth and death. A man who understood exactly what needed to be said, calculated the unbearable cost of saying it, and decided to act anyway. The memory that haunted him most was not of the front lines or of any operation gone wrong. It was a date, March 17th, 1943. That was when intelligence from the United States first reached his desk regarding a single industrial complex called Willow Run. Since then, the date had followed him like a ghost. Through every transfer, every late-night meeting, every guarded conversation, it remained lodged in his mind like shrapnel that refused extraction. It was, he realized, the day Germany's defeat had been written into existence, though almost no one yet understood it. The initial figures had seemed implausible, bordering on absurd. A single facility producing 1 bomber per hour, 24 aircraft every single day. Canaris, a meticulous man by training, had demanded verification. His analysts double-checked the numbers, confirmed the logistics, mapped out shipping lines and resource chains. But nothing changed. The conclusion was undeniable. American industrial capacity had reached a scale beyond imagination. And as the weeks passed, disbelief hardened into clarity and clarity into dread. Among the elite of the German military, only Canaris fully grasped the immensity of what those figures implied. The war's outcome was no longer in question. It was merely a matter of time. Yet in Hitler's Germany, truth was not a virtue. It was a liability. Canaris, by 1943, understood that better than anyone alive. At 59, the Admiral had navigated 10 years within the toxic labyrinth of Nazi power, 10 years of whispers, purges, and vanishing colleagues. As the head of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, he had perfected the art of discretion. He'd learned to mask reality in the language of optimism, to bury fatal conclusions beneath layers of technical phrasing. He understood exactly which truths could be shared, which must be diluted, and which could never be spoken at all. The Willow Run intelligence fell into that last fatal category. Still, he tried. His first briefing to Hermann Göring had been precise, carefully worded, devoid of overt alarmism. He laid out the facts. American industry had reorganized under total war mobilization. Mass production had reached an unprecedented rhythm, but Göring, indulgent and complacent, had laughed. The Americans excel at refrigerators and razor blades, he had scoffed, slapping his thigh in amusement. They cannot manufacture aircraft. Canaris remembered that laugh vividly, the guttural burst of arrogance echoing through the marble chamber. It was a sound he had come to associate with the Reich's fatal blindness. That mixture of confidence and contempt, the sound of a man incapable of believing that reality might not bend to ideology. Göring's laughter was not merely dismissive, it was diagnostic. It revealed the sickness at the heart of the Nazi hierarchy, the belief that willpower could replace mathematics. Still, Canaris persisted. For the next 2 years, his agents continued to gather evidence. Reports flowed in from across Europe, industrial analyses, intercepted communications, satellite intelligence through neutral intermediaries. Even Japan, Germany's own ally, sent back observations from its naval attachés stationed in Washington, astonished at the pace of American production. Their messages carried a tone of disbelief tinged with apology, as if they regretted confirming the nightmare. The numbers, once inconceivable, became routine. Germany was not fighting an army anymore. It was fighting an economy so vast that even total German mobilization could not compete. Each confirmation weighed heavier upon him. Canaris's mind worked like a ledger, and each new report was another entry on the side of inevitability. He realized that the end was not just probable, it was mathematically certain. Yet what does one do with such knowledge inside a regime that punished reality itself? He chose the only path available, half-truths. His reports became more cautious, his tone more neutral. He informed those he trusted, but cloaked his conclusions in professional ambiguity. It was the survival instinct of a man who had learned that blunt honesty could be lethal. Others had not been so careful. Officers who dared to speak too plainly found themselves reassigned to meaningless posts, stripped of their authority, or quietly disappeared. Canaris survived because he understood timing, when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to speak so softly that it sounded like silence. Yet by late 1944, that delicate equilibrium began to fracture. The empire he had once navigated like a chessboard was dissolving into chaos. Every day brought new reports of collapse, Soviet armies sweeping through Poland, Allied bombers reducing cities to ash, American troops pouring across the Rhine. The Reich was disintegrating, and with it the protection afforded by cautious neutrality. And still, Hitler's conviction only deepened. Each defeat seemed to harden his delusion. In the Führer's mind, victory was not lost. It was merely delayed by insufficient faith. The leadership's obsession with belief had transformed into madness. Logic had become treason. Facts, sabotage. The worse things became, the more violently they clung to their fantasies. Canaris watched this descent with growing horror. It was as if the entire regime had entered a collective psychosis, feeding upon its own denial. By early 1945, Germany's military situation had become terminal. Soviet troops were already in East Prussia. The Western Allies controlled the skies. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, its pilots undertrained, its fuel reserves nearly gone. The once proud Wehrmacht was fractured and exhausted. Everything that had once been unthinkable was now daily reality. The precise scenario Canaris had warned of 2 years earlier was unfolding before his eyes. Worse still, people remembered. Those cautious reports he had submitted, those veiled warnings buried in the language of intelligence summaries, they resurfaced. Within Hitler's paranoid circle, such documents were no longer viewed as prudence, but as evidence of defeatism. His professional caution now looked like disloyalty. In a regime built on suspicion, that was enough to mark a man for death. Canaris knew the pattern. He had seen it consume others. First the warning, then the dismissal, then the accusation. You overestimate our enemies. You spread defeatist ideas. You undermine the Führer. Each stage brought a man closer to the gallows. And Canaris knew he was already on that path. He had never been a fanatic. In quiet ways, he had resisted the regime he served. Through the Abwehr, he had sheltered dissidents, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He had maneuvered to prevent Spain from joining the Axis, sparing Germany another front it could not sustain. He had engaged in subtle acts of sabotage masked as bureaucratic inefficiency. But all of it, every carefully calculated act of defiance, felt tragically insufficient now. After the failed July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, the net began to close. The Gestapo's investigation exposed an entire network of resistance within the military, and the Abwehr was at its center. The web inevitably led to Canaris. He was arrested in 1944, yet for months the regime did not execute him. Instead, he was shuffled between prisons, Berlin, Sachsenhausen, then Flossenburg, while investigators dissected his life. As Germany itself collapsed, Canaris lived in a strange limbo, a condemned man awaiting a state that was itself dying. Now, in April 1945, with Soviet artillery audible even inside the prison walls, he faced the question he had postponed for 2 years. Should he finally speak? Should he leave behind a record, a confession, a testimony that revealed the truth he had carried since 1943? Should he, at the final hour, name the exact moment when the war had been lost, not on the battlefield, but in a factory in Michigan? The answer no longer depended on strategy or consequence. It was a moral reckoning. Canaris had spent a lifetime mastering the art of survival, the calculus of risk, the subtle manipulation of power. But survival had brought him here, to a cell, awaiting execution by a dying regime. And so in those final days, he made his last and simplest calculation, that truth, even whispered into oblivion, might outlive the lies that killed him, that training sustained him through a decade of shadow and survival, 10 long years beneath the cold machinery of Nazi rule, where suspicion lived in every corridor and trust had long since become an obsolete concept. He had outlasted rivals, purges and investigations that had destroyed countless others. Yet now, in April of 1945, as Berlin lay in ruins and the empire crumbled around him, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris finally began to understand the invisible cost of all those careful calculations. The price had not been written in ink or measured in lost battles. It had been paid in silence, paid in fragments of integrity, piece by piece, each withheld truth, another coin spent to purchase survival. That was the final truth of his existence. Survival demanded silence. And silence, he now realized, had its own form of betrayal. It meant watching lies grow stronger by the hour, watching a delusional ideology consume reality without resistance. It meant standing in rooms filled with men clinging to fantasies while knowing precisely what the numbers said. It meant allowing history's greatest self-deception to continue unchallenged, because speaking would end not only one's career but one's life. Every softened report, every ambiguous phrasing, every cautious omission now weighed upon him like a confession unspoken. Each document he had carefully diluted to avoid accusations of defeatism represented not merely prudence, but a fracture in the very integrity he had once believed unshakable. Canaris had always trusted data. Facts to him were sacred, his only true faith. His religion was accuracy. His scripture was evidence. His God was truth itself. Intelligence work at its core was supposed to be the art of separating what was real from what was wished for. It demanded a devotion to reality that ignored ideology, politics, and personal ambition. That was the ideal Canaris had embraced in his youth, the belief that if one understood the truth well enough, if one documented it clearly enough, it could shape outcomes. But what use, he now asked himself, was information that never left the report? What value existed in a truth that never reached the world beyond the desk it was written on? A truth protected too carefully ceased to be truth at all. It became a secret, and secrets, Canaris understood too late, had a way of becoming lies through mere omission. He thought of the men who had died believing in the invincibility of the Reich, pilots who'd flown obsolete aircraft, soldiers thrown into hopeless defenses, commanders who'd been told reinforcements were coming when none existed. They had perished under banners of confidence sustained by silence like his. He thought too of one man in particular, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian and moral philosopher he had once protected through Abwehr channels, hiding him under the pretext of intelligence work. Bonhoeffer had written of complicity, of how silence in the face of evil was itself a form of participation. Canaris had once regarded those words as the lofty musings of an idealist, unburdened by power's realities. In the world he inhabited, idealism was a luxury, not a survival tool. But now, sitting in his Flossenburg cell, the distant rumble of artillery echoing through the walls, he wondered if Bonhoeffer had seen further than he ever had. The theologian's writings, smuggled, circulated in whispers, had asked the question that now haunted Canaris: at what point does silence become guilt? In those bleak final days, Canaris made his decision. There would be no more reports, no coded language, no careful moderation. He would not hide behind professionalism any longer. He would speak, not to the powerful, for they were deaf, but to the powerless. To the men imprisoned beside him, to history itself, to the record that would survive even when he did not. He would leave behind, if nothing else, the unvarnished truth. He began recounting to fellow prisoners what the Willow Run intelligence had truly revealed, that Germany's defeat was not the consequence of poor generalship or lack of will. It was written into the arithmetic of industry. He described how in 1943, one American facility was producing a bomber every hour, 24 bombers each day, while German factories struggled to build even a fraction of that number under constant bombardment. He explained that no amount of tactical genius or ideological zeal could overcome that imbalance. Industrial output, he told them, was the modern weapon, cold, unfeeling, unstoppable. It was mathematics in motion, and he made something else clear: the Nazi leadership had known. The intelligence had been gathered, documented, and presented. It had not been ignored through ignorance. It had been rejected through arrogance. The regime's high command had chosen ideology over physics, faith over fact, and belief over evidence. Canaris described Göring's laughter when shown the figures, Hitler's fury when confronted with defeatism, and the slow institutional drift toward delusion that followed. The Reich had not been betrayed by spies or saboteurs. It had been betrayed by its own refusal to see. By any standard of the regime, those words constituted treason. Canaris knew this. In Nazi Germany, truth itself had long since become a subversive act. But clarity, he decided, was the only rebellion left to him. For years, he had been the consummate intelligence officer, the quiet manipulator who balanced truth and survival like weights on a scale. That skill had preserved his life and his influence, but in the end, it had also preserved the very system he despised. Every cautious word, every strategic pause, every unspoken sentence had helped maintain the illusion that reality could be deferred. Now, on the edge of death, he recognized that his discretion had not been neutrality, it had been complicity. His silence had kept madness alive. The realization cut through him with a precision sharper than any interrogator's knife. And so he decided there would be no more discretion. The act of speaking was not dramatic. There was no grand proclamation. There was only a tired man in a dim cell explaining the facts as they were, quietly, steadily, methodically, to those who would listen. Yet in that small act lay his final rebellion. He knew the price. At Flossenburg, the SS executioners were efficient and cruel. On April 9, 1945, as the war staggered toward its end, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was stripped naked, humiliated, and slowly strangled with piano wire. It was a deliberately degrading death, designed not merely to end his life, but to erase his dignity. Yet dignity, paradoxically, was what he reclaimed in those final moments. He had spent his life navigating a system without moral compass, trying to remain uncorrupted in a sea of corruption. In the end, he succeeded only when he ceased trying to navigate it at all, when he stopped playing the game of survival and chose truth instead. His final words were never recorded in official transcripts, but witnesses later recounted his calm demeanor, his refusal to plead, and his last act of silent composure. Within weeks, the war ended. The Reich he had once served collapsed into ash and silence. The men who had laughed at his warnings either took their own lives or stood trial. Nothing Canaris said changed the outcome, but what he said changed understanding, because after the war, his diaries surfaced. His memoranda were declassified. His former colleagues testified to the warnings he had issued, the reports he had filed, the analyses he had delivered. And suddenly, history could see what had been invisible in his lifetime. That one man, at the heart of Nazi intelligence, had understood the truth years before the end. And that truth had been buried under layers of denial. Canaris's story became something more than biography. It became evidence. Proof that the Reich had not been blind. It had been willfully blind. Proof that its leaders had known the reality of their situation and chosen delusion over data. Proof that defeat had been inevitable, not because Germany lacked courage, but because it lacked honesty. He had grasped, with unmatched precision, the meaning of Willow Run. He had recognized, as early as March 1943, that industrial mathematics, not strategy, not morale, not propaganda, would decide the war. And though he failed to convince those in power, he ultimately succeeded in ensuring that history would know he had tried. That is the legacy of Wilhelm Canaris. His life stands as a warning carved in the language of intelligence reports and prison diaries, that the greatest danger to any society is not ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected through learning. The true danger lies in knowledge suppressed, truth diluted, facts acknowledged privately but denied publicly. It is the sickness of institutions that prize image over substance, obedience over integrity, survival over honesty. For years, Canaris embodied that sickness, believing he could outmaneuver it from within. But at the end, he shed it. He chose not calculation but confession, not silence but speech, not safety but truth. And though his words did not save his world, they remain a testament to the enduring value of clarity in an age of deceit. Because a society that hides from uncomfortable facts will always perish, not from external conquest, but from internal rot. Canaris, finally, understood this. And in that understanding, he became what he had always wanted to be, not merely an intelligence officer, but a man of integrity. He died for that integrity, but in doing so, he ensured that history would never again mistake silence for virtue.